Victorian mourning customs included creating jewelry, art, and keepsakes from deceased family members' hair, but a thriving industry emerged selling mourning hair from unknown corpses to meet demand. Professional hair harvesters worked in morgues, hospitals, and funeral homes, collecting hair from the dead to supply jewelry makers and memorial artists who advertised authentic mourning pieces. The most expensive hair came from young women and children, with blonde hair commanding premium prices and red hair considered especially valuable for its rarity. Hair dealers maintained detailed inventories categorizing hair by color, length, and texture, with some specializing in suicide hair, claiming it came from people who died by their own hand, which was believed to hold special properties. Investigations revealed that much commercial mourning hair actually came from living sources, poorhouses, prisons, and asylums, where inmates were forced to sell their hair for survival money. The industry produced elaborate hair wreaths, jewelry, and artwork that families displayed in homes, unknowingly decorating with strangers' hair while believing they honored dead relatives. Victorian hair artists developed complex techniques for weaving hair into intricate patterns, flowers, and even three-dimensional sculptures, with some pieces containing hair from dozens of different corpses. Chemical analysis of surviving Victorian hair jewelry reveals many pieces contain hair from multiple individuals, proving widespread use of commercial supplies rather than family hair. The practice created a macabre secondary market, where grave robbers specifically targeted corpses with valuable hair. Medieval dentistry was based on the belief that tooth pain came from worms living inside teeth, leading to treatments that often killed patients through infection, poisoning, or blood loss. Dentists used heated metal probes to burn out the worms, actually destroying tooth nerves and often puncturing sinuses, causing fatal brain infections. The standard treatment involved placing burning candles against aching teeth, believing heat would force worms to emerge, but this caused severe burns and often ignited hair or clothing. Archaeological analysis of medieval skulls shows evidence of these treatments, perfectly round holes drilled through tooth enamel, often accompanied by signs of severe infection that spread to jaw bones and caused death. Dentists prescribed worm medicines containing mercury, arsenic, and lead, which poisoned patients while providing no dental relief, and often caused organ failure before tooth problems could heal. Medieval medical texts describe extracting tooth worms using tiny hooks and forceps, though no worms were ever actually found, suggesting dentists were simply damaging tooth pulp and claiming success when pain temporarily stopped due to nerve destruction. Some treatments involve filling tooth cavities with molten lead or gold, while patients remained conscious and unrestrained, causing shock, burns, and often death from metal poisoning. The most extreme treatment was complete jaw removal for persistent worm infestations, leaving patients unable to eat and typically dying within weeks from starvation or infection. Museum collections contain medieval dental tools that show evidence of being used to drill, burn, and scrape teeth, with many implements resembling torture devices more than medical instruments. Modern forensic analysis of medieval cemetery remains shows that dental treatments had mortality rates approaching 40%. During plague outbreaks, entire ships became floating morgues with crews dying faster than bodies could be disposed of, creating ghost vessels that drifted with cargo holds full of corpses. The most infamous was the merchant vessel Mary Celeste prototype, not the famous ship, but a plague vessel found in 1665 with 200 decomposed bodies in the hold, and evidence that surviving crew members had resorted to cannibalism. Ship's logs from plague vessels describe crews throwing bodies overboard daily, then hourly, then being too weak to dispose of the dead who were left to rot in living quarters. The combination of plague, starvation, and close quarters created conditions where survivors often went insane, with some ships found with evidence that crew members had murdered each other in delirium. Plague ships often carried rats that continued breeding among the corpses, creating massive infestations that spread disease to any port they reached, leading to policies of burning entire vessels rather than risking harbor contamination. Maritime records document over 300 death ships during major plague outbreaks, with some found months later drifting empty, except for skeletons and cargo. The psychological toll on surviving crew members was devastating. Many were found having written farewell messages in blood or carved final words into wooden surfaces using their fingernails. Ships' manifests show that many plague vessels carried families seeking refuge, with entire bloodlines dying during voyages, their bodies thrown overboard in canvas shrouds that often tore, scattering remains across ocean surfaces. Some ships were discovered with crew members chained to their posts. Medieval executioners practiced living statue torture, coating condemned prisoners in molten metal or wax to create human sculptures, preserving their death agonies in permanent form. The process began by restraining victims in artistic poses, then slowly pouring molten bronze, lead, or silver over their bodies, ensuring gradual death rather than immediate shock. Historical records from the Spanish Inquisition describe this method used on heretics, with their metal-encased corpses displayed in town squares as warnings. The technique required precise temperature control. Too hot, and victims died instantly from shock. Too cool, and the metal wouldn't flow properly, necessitating reheating while victims remained alive and conscious. Executioners often targeted political prisoners or religious dissidents whose statue displays served propaganda purposes, with plaques explaining their crimes mounted beside the metallic corpses. Archaeological excavations in Spanish and Italian execution sites have uncovered human skeletons still encased in corroded metal, with bone analysis showing extreme stress fractures from struggling against the hardening metal. The torture could take 30 to 60 minutes depending on metal choice and body coverage, with victims remaining conscious through most of the process as circulation slowly ceased. Some examples included artistic elements, crowns of thorns, crosses, or political symbols, incorporated into the molten coating while victims died. Museum collections contain several living statue examples, though most are displayed without explaining their human origin. Modern metallurgical analysis of these artifacts confirms they contain human bones and show pouring patterns consistent with coating living subjects rather than creating traditional sculptures over armatures. Victorian mourning practices involve preserving bodies in sealed glass coffins filled with alcohol or formaldehyde, but these sometimes exploded from gas buildup, showering mourners with decomposed remains and shattered glass. The most documented case occurred at a London wake in 1875, where a glass coffin containing a child exploded during the funeral service, covering 30 mourners with putrefied flesh and toxic preservation chemicals. The explosion resulted from methane and hydrogen sulfide gases, produced by decomposition, which built pressure until the glass shattered with the force of a small bomb. Funeral home records describe glass coffins as popular among wealthy families who wanted to view deceased relatives indefinitely, but funeral directors often warned about explosion risks after 10 to 14 days. The preservative chemicals, typically formaldehyde mixed with ethanol, created additional hazards when explosions occurred, causing chemical burns and blindness among mourners exposed to the spray. Victorian newspapers documented at least 30 glass coffin explosions between 1860 and 1900, with several resulting in deaths from glass wounds and chemical exposure. Morticians developed pressure release valves for glass coffins, but many families rejected these modifications because they ruined the aesthetic appeal of the transparent containers. The explosions typically occurred during viewing services or wakes, maximizing trauma for grieving families who witnessed their loved ones literally exploding before their eyes. Modern forensic analysis of surviving Victorian glass coffin fragments shows stress fractures consistent with internal pressure buildup, confirming that these explosions were inevitable given the preservation methods and sealed containers used. Amputees experience phantom limb pain in 60 to 80% of cases, feeling excruciating agony in limbs that no longer exist, with some patients attempting self-harm to stop pain in missing body parts. Civil War amputation patients describe feeling their absent hands clenching so tightly that phantom fingernails seem to cut into phantom palms, creating real psychological torment. The pain often exceeds that of the original injury, with patients reporting burning, crushing, or stabbing sensations that can persist for decades after amputation. Medical records from the American Civil War document soldiers trying to scratch itches on missing limbs, sometimes clawing at empty air until their stumps bled. Some amputees report feeling wedding rings still tight on missing fingers or phantom shoes that feel too small. creating psychological distress that often leads to depression and sometimes self-harm. Neurological studies show the brain continues sending pain signals to missing limbs, creating a neural memory of the absent body part that can be more vivid than sensations from existing limbs. Phantom sensations aren't limited to pain. Some patients feel phantom limbs, moving, bending, or touching objects, with their brains refusing to accept the amputation. Modern treatments include mirror therapy, where patients watch intact limbs in mirrors positioned to create illusions of missing limbs, sometimes providing relief by tricking the brain. Historical accounts describe amputees reaching for objects with missing hands or trying to walk on missing legs, sometimes causing dangerous falls. The phenomenon affects war veterans disproportionately, with some Civil War soldiers reporting phantom bullets still lodged in missing limbs, feeling the projectiles moving and causing pain decades after amputation and wound healing. Edinburgh's Burke and Hare murdered 16 people in 1828 to sell fresh corpses to medical schools, pioneering the Burking method of suffocation that left no visible wounds on bodies. They targeted vulnerable individuals, elderly, drunk, or homeless, luring them to lodging houses where they were murdered and delivered to Dr. Robert Knox within hours. The pair developed systematic techniques. One would cover the victim's mouth while the other pressed down on the chest, causing death by asphyxiation without obvious trauma. They charged premium prices for fresh subjects, earning 8 to 10 pounds per body when average workers made £1 monthly. Burke and Hare kept detailed accounts of their victims, noting ages, physical conditions, and delivery times, treating murder as a business enterprise. They specifically targeted people who wouldn't be missed: travelers, prostitutes, and mentally ill individuals, making their disappearances less likely to trigger investigations. The medical school asked no questions about the constant supply of warm bodies, with Dr. Knox paying bonuses for particularly fresh specimens delivered within 12 hours of death. When caught, Burke was hanged and publicly dissected, with his skeleton displayed in Edinburgh Medical School, where it remains today. Hare turned evidence and escaped prosecution, but was reportedly murdered years later by victims' relatives. The case led to the Anatomy Act of 1832, regulating body procurement for medical education, but archaeological evidence suggests similar operations existed in other cities, with mass graves near medical schools containing evidence of systematic murder for anatomical supply. Nazi concentration camps used human ash and bone meal as fertilizer for camp vegetable gardens that fed SS officers and their families. At Auschwitz, crematoria ash was mixed with soil to grow tomatoes, potatoes, and cabbage, creating a horrific cycle where victims literally nourished their murderers' meals. The ash, rich in phosphates and calcium from human bones, produced unusually large vegetables that were prized by camp commandants' wives for their gardens. Prisoners forced to tend these gardens reported nightmares about planting crops and human remains, with some attempting self-harm rather than continue the work. Soil analysis from former campsites reveals abnormally high calcium phosphate levels, confirming the widespread use of human ash as fertilizer. The gardens were watered with runoff from crematorium operations, which often contained particles of bone and teeth that survivors recall finding in the soil. Camp records show systematic collection and distribution of processed organic matter to agricultural areas, euphemistically describing human ash. Post-war investigations found that local farms surrounding camps had unknowingly used human-derived fertilizer sold by camp administrators as waste material. Modern chemical analysis of soil samples from these garden sites can still detect human DNA and elevated levels of metals from dental work, proving the extent of this practice. Survivors who worked these gardens suffered lasting psychological trauma, with many reporting inability to eat vegetables for decades after liberation, haunted by memories of tending crops grown in human remains. Japan's Unit 731 conducted biological warfare experiments on living humans during World War II, performing over 3,000 documented vivisections without anesthesia and killing an estimated 200,000 to 300,000 people through medical torture. Subjects were infected with plague, anthrax, and cholera, then dissected alive to observe disease progression, with doctors noting that screaming interfered with precise observations. Prisoners were subjected to pressure chamber experiments until their eyes burst from their sockets and intestines emerged from their bodies. Frostbite experiments involved freezing limbs in liquid nitrogen, then thawing them with boiling water while subjects remained conscious and restrained. Victims were centrifuged to death, electrocuted, dehydrated, and subjected to lethal X-ray doses to study radiation effects. Children were specifically targeted for experiments measuring pain, tolerance, and survival limits under extreme conditions. The facility included specialized buildings for different torture methods, vivisection labs, pressure chambers, and clinical rooms where subjects were slowly murdered while being medically monitored. Doctors kept detailed notes on subjects' reactions, recording exact times until death and preserving organs in formaldehyde for later study. After the war, American authorities granted immunity to Unit 731 doctors in exchange for experimental data, allowing these war criminals to continue medical careers in Japan and America. Archaeological excavations near the Unit 731 site continued discovering mass graves containing thousands of victims, many showing evidence of surgical torture and medical experimentation. Medieval justice system used trial by ordeal, where accused persons underwent painful tests, believing God would protect the innocent, but these procedures had designed mortality rates approaching 80%. The ordeal of hot iron required carrying a red-hot iron bar 9 paces. If burns didn't heal cleanly within 3 days, guilt was established. Medical analysis shows this test caused third-degree burns that inevitably became infected, effectively ensuring death sentences. The ordeal of boiling water involved retrieving objects from boiling cauldrons, causing severe scalding that led to fatal shock or infection in most cases. Cold water ordeal involved binding suspects and throwing them in rivers. Innocence was proven by sinking and drowning, while floating indicated guilt and execution. Poison communion, used for suspected clergy, involved consuming blessed bread mixed with toxins. Survival proved divine protection, but most died within hours from arsenic or mercury poisoning. Trial records from medieval England show that of 847 documented ordeals, only 164 persons survived long enough to be declared innocent. The ordeal of the cross required standing with arms outstretched until collapse. Most died from exhaustion, dehydration, or cardiac arrest after 6 to 12 hours. Archaeological excavations of medieval execution sites reveal many skeletons show evidence of ordeal injuries before execution. For centuries, artists used bone black paint made from charred animal bones, but premium versions were created from human remains obtained from battlefields and plague pits. The finest bone black came from young human bones, which produced deeper, more stable pigments than animal alternatives. During the Napoleonic Wars, bone collectors scoured battlefields specifically to supply paint manufacturers, gathering skulls and femurs for processing. The bones were heated in sealed chambers to prevent ash formation, creating an intense black pigment that was ground into powder and mixed with oil. Leonardo da Vinci reportedly preferred bone black made from plague victims' remains for his darker paintings, believing human bone produced superior depth and permanence. Archaeological evidence from medieval paint workshops shows human teeth and bone fragments in grinding equipment, confirming the practice was widespread. Artists prized bone black because it mixed smoothly, didn't fade, and created the deepest blacks possible with period technology. The most expensive bone black was made from children's bones, which contain more carbon and less mineral content, producing richer pigments. Modern chemical analysis of famous paintings reveals many contain human bone-derived pigments, including works by Rembrandt and Caravaggio. Over 200 documented cases exist of humans apparently bursting into flames without external ignition sources, leaving only lower legs and feet intact while the rest of the body burns completely. The most famous case involved Mary Reeser in 1951, found as a pile of ash in her Florida apartment with only her left foot remaining in a slipper. The extreme heat required to completely consume a human body, 1,648 degrees Fahrenheit, 900 degrees Celsius, should have destroyed the entire room, yet surrounding furniture remained untouched. Forensic investigations reveal that in typical cases, the torso burns completely while extremities remain intact, suggesting the fire starts internally and burns outward. Victims are usually found in sitting positions, often near fireplaces or while smoking, but witness accounts describe flames appearing instantaneously without visible ignition sources. The fat content in human bodies can sustain combustion like a candle wick, but reaching ignition temperature without external heat sources remains unexplained. Coroner reports describe a sweet, sickly smell at SHC scenes, different from typical fire odors, and often mention a fine, powdery residue that coats nearby surfaces. Chemical analysis of SHC ash shows unusual crystalline structures not found in normal fire residue and often contains trace elements not typically present in human remains. Medieval plague doctors wore distinctive beaked masks filled with aromatic herbs, believing smell caused disease, but their medical tools were instruments of torture disguised as treatment. The beak contained a mixture of roses, thyme, and lavender, but also ground unicorn horn, actually narwhal tusk, and crushed pearls, making each mask worth a small fortune. Doctors carried pointed sticks to examine patients without touching them, but these often became weapons when terrified plague victims tried to flee. Their standard treatment involved lancing buboes, swollen lymph nodes, with red-hot irons, believing pus release cured plague, though this usually caused fatal hemorrhaging. They prescribed venous treacle, a mixture containing over 60 ingredients including viper's flesh, which often poisoned patients faster than plague killed them. Plague doctors' leather coats were soaked in wax and fat, creating waterproof barriers, but the coating often contained lead that caused additional poisoning. Their wide-brimmed hats were designed to deflect bad air, but also served to hide their identities since many were actually convicted criminals offered freedom in exchange for treating plague victims. Historical records show plague doctors had mortality rates higher than untreated patients. Archaeological excavations of plague doctor burials reveal their skeletons contain extremely high levels of mercury and arsenic from their own medicines, suggesting they poisoned themselves while attempting to treat others. Numerous British estates house screaming skulls, human skulls that allegedly shriek when removed from their designated locations. The most famous is at Bettiscombe Manor in Dorset, where a slave's skull has resided since 1685, reportedly screaming whenever moved. Scientific analysis revealed the skull belonged to a young woman, not the claimed male slave, and radiocarbon dating suggests it's over 2,000 years old, predating the slave story by millennia. The skull shows evidence of violent death, a depressed fracture consistent with blunt force trauma and stress marks indicating prolonged torture. Residents report the skull's jaw occasionally moves on its own, opening and closing as if trying to speak. During World War II, when the skull was temporarily relocated for safety, witnesses reported blood-curdling screams emanating from its storage location at night. The Burton Agnes Hall skull in Yorkshire was allegedly that of Anne Griffith, who was murdered by robbers in 1620, but forensic analysis suggests it belonged to someone who died much earlier and shows signs of deliberate skull modification, consistent with ancient Celtic practices. Acoustic tests reveal these skulls are often positioned in locations where wind patterns could create whistling sounds, but many phenomena occur on still nights. Several estate owners have attempted to bury or remove their screaming skulls. Medical schools' demand for fresh corpses created a thriving body-snatching industry in the 18th and 19th centuries in Britain and America. Resurrectionists worked in organized gangs using wooden tools to avoid metal detector-like grave goods and could exhume and deliver a fresh corpse within 6 hours of burial. The most notorious gang, led by Jerry Cruncher, supplied bodies to London's medical schools for decades, maintaining detailed records of deliveries. Fresh corpses were worth 10 to 20 times a laborer's weekly wage, creating a black market economy around death. Body snatchers preferred winter burials when cold weather preserved corpses longer, and they often staked out funerals to identify fresh targets. Wealthy families hired armed guards to watch graves for weeks after burial, while poor families used mort safes, heavy iron cages placed over graves until decomposition made bodies worthless for dissection. The snatchers developed sophisticated techniques. They dig a tunnel to the head of the coffin, break it open, and pull the body out head first to avoid disturbing the entire grave. Records from Edinburgh Medical School show they received over 500 anonymous donations annually during peak years. Post-mortem photography was a booming industry in Victorian times, with families paying photographers to create lasting images of deceased relatives, especially children. Photographers developed techniques to position corpses naturally, using wire stands to prop up bodies, and painting open eyes on closed eyelids. The most disturbing trend involved sleeping portraits, where dead children were posed with living family members, creating family photos that included both the living and the dead. Professional photographers specialized in these images, with some studios advertising lifelike positioning and natural coloring services. The dead were often the best dressed and most prominently featured family members in these portraits, as they couldn't move during long exposure times. Photographers used mercury-based chemicals to preserve skin color during lengthy photo sessions, often working in homes where bodies had been lying for days. Hidden metal frameworks supported corpses in standing positions, while smaller children were positioned in chairs or beds, surrounded by toys. The practice was so common that many Victorian family albums contain more photos of dead relatives than living ones. Modern forensic analysis of these photographs can identify cause of death through visible symptoms. Cholera victims show characteristic dehydration. Historical records document over 300 instances of red rain falling from clear skies, often coinciding with mass deaths from warfare or plague. The most famous occurred in Kerala, India, in 2001, where red-colored rain fell for 2 months, staining clothes and soil crimson. Laboratory analysis revealed the rain contained microscopic red particles resembling blood cells, though their origin remains disputed. During the Black Death, chroniclers recorded blood rain falling over European cities just before plague outbreaks, with some drops leaving permanent stains on stone buildings that are still visible today. In 1890, blood rain in Calabria, Italy, preceded a cholera epidemic that killed thousands, with locals believing it was a divine warning. Forensic analysis of preserved samples shows the red matter contains hemoglobin and other blood proteins, suggesting an atmospheric phenomenon that somehow incorporates actual blood into precipitation. Theories range from high-altitude bird kills to meteoric debris containing organic compounds. Medieval accounts describe people drinking the red rain and immediately falling ill with fever and delirium. Modern chemical analysis of historical blood rain stains on medieval churches reveals they contain human DNA, though how human genetic material reached such heights remains unexplained. During World War II, Nazi concentration camps operated bone-grinding mills that processed human remains into fertilizer and industrial materials. At Treblinka, a massive bone-crushing machine ran 12 hours daily, reducing skeletal remains to powder that was scattered across camp vegetable gardens. Survivors described the horrific sound, a constant grinding mixed with occasional metallic clangs when metal dental work jammed the machinery. The bone meal was also sold to local farms as phosphate fertilizer, meaning human remains literally nourished crops consumed by unknowing civilians. Camp records show the mill processed an estimated 870,000 bodies over 2 years. Operators wore primitive masks, but the calcium dust caused severe respiratory damage, and many died from lung complications. The mill building's foundation, discovered in the 1960s excavations, contained bone fragments ground so fine they resembled flour, mixed with gold dust from dental work. Soil samples from surrounding areas still contain abnormally high calcium and phosphate levels. Survivors reported nightmares about the constant mechanical grinding sound, which ran day and night, sometimes interrupted by screams when prisoners were forced to operate the machinery. The mill's grinding stones. Victorian fears of being buried alive were well-founded. Medical journals from the era document hundreds of confirmed cases of premature interment. The London Association for the Prevention of Premature Burial, founded in 1896, investigated over 200 suspected cases annually. Exhumed coffins often revealed scratched interiors, torn fingernails embedded in wood, and bodies found in positions indicating desperate escape attempts. Patent safety coffins included bells, breathing tubes, and escape mechanisms, though few worked when needed. Dr. Franz Hartmann documented a case where a woman awoke during her funeral service, sitting up in her coffin and screaming before dying of shock minutes later. The The famous violinist Niccolò Paganini was kept above ground for months because authorities feared he'd been buried alive after witnesses claimed to hear violin music from his grave. Medical manuals recommended waiting 72 hours before burial, checking for pulse in multiple locations, and even making small incisions to test for bleeding. Mortuaries employed watchers who monitored corpses for signs of life, sometimes for weeks. Archaeological evidence from Victorian cemeteries shows approximately 2% of exhumed coffins contain evidence of premature burial. Until the 19th century, European pharmacies regularly sold corpse medicine, human body parts ground into powders or preserved in alcohol for medical treatments. Mumia, made from Egyptian mummies, was prescribed for epilepsy, while powdered human skull treated migraines. Fresh human blood was drunk warm to cure epilepsy, collected directly from execution sites where crowds gathered with cups. Executioners sold pieces of rope from hangings, hair from the condemned, and virgin's milk, breast milk from executed women, for various ailments. Apothecary records from London show regular purchases of human fat for treating arthritis, ground bones for consumption, and human liver preserved in wine for digestive ailments. The King of England's personal physician prescribed powdered human heart for cardiac conditions. Grave robbers supplied fresh corpses to medical suppliers who processed them into pills, tinctures, and ointments sold in respectable pharmacies. The practice persisted because many genuinely believed human remains held curative properties, especially from those who died violently. Archaeological evidence from pharmacy excavations reveals grinding equipment still containing bone dust and storage jars with human tissue residue. Baby farms operated across Victorian England where unwed mothers paid to have their infants cared for by women who systematically murdered them. Amelia Dyer, Britain's most prolific serial killer, operated such establishments for over 30 years, killing an estimated 400 plus babies by strangulation with tape or drowning. Police discovered her operation in 1896 when bodies began washing up in the Thames, wrapped in distinctive paper bearing her address. Autopsies revealed babies had been starved, poisoned with laudanum, or strangled within hours of arrival. She kept detailed records of payments received but used aliases for victims, making identification impossible. Her cottage's garden contained lime pits where she dissolved infant corpses, and forensic excavation found bone fragments from dozens of victims. Other baby farmers like Margaret Waters fed infants quieting syrup containing morphine and treacle, causing slow death from organ failure. The practice thrived due to social stigma around illegitimate children and lack of birth registration. Police estimates suggest over 20,000 infants died in these establishments between 1860 to 1890. Due to New Orleans' high water table and humid climate, bodies buried in traditional graves often undergo explosive decomposition, literally bursting from their caskets during floods. The city's famous above-ground cemeteries exist because underground burial results in corpses resurfacing during heavy rains, creating public health nightmares. During Hurricane Katrina, over 1,000 caskets floated through flooded streets, some exploding from built-up gases, scattering decomposed remains throughout neighborhoods. The methane and hydrogen sulfide produced by anaerobic decomposition creates pressure that can blow apart wooden caskets with the force of a small bomb. Cemetery workers report finding casket fragments embedded in nearby tomb walls after such explosions. The smell, described as sweet rotting meat mixed with sewage, can be detected miles away and causes immediate vomiting in most people. Families often hear their deceased relatives' caskets knocking or tapping from expanding gases, leading to persistent urban legends about the restless dead. Forensic investigators have documented cases where explosion force scattered skeletal remains across multiple city blocks. In July 1518, residents of Strasbourg began dancing uncontrollably, unable to stop until they collapsed from exhaustion or died from heart failure. It started with Frau Trophea, who danced alone in the street for days, soon joined by 34 others, then eventually 400 people. The phenomenon lasted months, with dancers bleeding through their shoes, screaming in agony while their bodies continued moving involuntarily. Municipal records describe dancers with torn tendons still gyrating, their feet worn to bone, streaming blood across cobblestones. Physicians blamed hot blood, and prescribed more dancing, hiring musicians and building stages, inadvertently worsening the epidemic. Autopsies on the dead revealed ruptured hearts and complete muscle breakdown. Modern theories suggest ergot poisoning from contaminated rye bread, causing hallucinations and seizures that resembled dance. The few surviving contemporary accounts describe dancers' eyes rolling back, speaking in tongues and clawing at their own faces while their bodies writhed. Some survivors reported feeling like puppets controlled by invisible strings. The Sedlec ossuary in Czech Republic contains artistically arranged remains of 40,000 to 70,000 people, creating chandeliers, coats of arms, and garlands from human skulls and femurs. Created by woodcarver František Rint in 1870, the church was built on a plague pit where victims of the 14th century Black Death were hastily buried in mass graves. The bones, initially stacked randomly, were bleached with lime and arranged into macabre decorations when the cemetery was renovated. Each skull shows different causes of death. Some have sword marks from medieval warfare, others display the characteristic jaw deterioration of syphilis, and many show evidence of malnutrition from famine. The chandelier alone contains every bone in the human body at least once. Visitors report an overwhelming musty smell and claim to hear whispers in the rafters. Chemical analysis of the bones reveals high mercury levels, indicating many died from medieval medical treatments. In Guanajuato, Mexico, a unique soil composition naturally mummified bodies buried between 1865 and 1958, but many corpses display expressions of absolute terror. The alkaline soil and dry climate preserved soft tissue so perfectly that facial expressions remained intact, revealing that several people were buried alive. The screaming mummy shows a jaw frozen open in eternal anguish, with fingernails worn to bone from clawing at the coffin lid. Forensic analysis revealed wood splinters under the nails and fabric fibers in the mouth from attempting to eat the burial shroud. During cholera outbreaks, victims showing minimal vital signs were hastily interred, only to regain consciousness underground. The cemetery's exhumation records from the 1950s noted that 12% of bodies showed signs of premature burial, including torn burial clothes and scratched coffin interiors. Roman emperors regularly used taste testers called pregustators to avoid assassination, but Emperor Claudius's wife Agrippina outsmarted this system in 54 CE. She coated only one side of mushrooms with deadly aconite, eating the safe side while Claudius consumed the poisoned portion. As he writhed in agony, she forced a feather dipped in more poison down his throat under the guise of inducing vomiting. His physician Locusta later confessed to helping prepare the toxins. Archaeological evidence from Palatine Hill reveals silver vessels with trace poison residue, confirming the prevalence of such murders. Claudius's body turned black within hours, a telltale sign of aconite poisoning, and was hastily cremated to destroy evidence. The remaining ashes, found in urns beneath the palace, showed abnormal mineral content consistent with heavy metal poisoning, proving this wasn't his first exposure to toxins.